Some people have bad days and some have bad weeks. Alphonso, on the other hand, was going to have the worst year of his life. Leaving his family and his kingdom behind, he made his way east across Castile. He then made his way across Aragon before crossing the Pyrenees and arriving in southern France. His already poor health continued to deteriorate as he went. The Pope was cognizant of this fact and decided to meet him halfway near the Rhone River. But like I mentioned before, Gregory X was no fan of the Castilian King, and he already had somebody else in mind to become the Holy Roman Emperor. Their negotiations were going to be doomed right from the start, but regardless, the two men proceeded to meet in May, and over a period of several meetings, Gregory X would reject, refuse, and decline every offer that was put on the table. The writing could not be more clearly spelled out. At the end of the negotiations, when it was all said and done, Alfonso's great quest had finally failed. His dream was over, and his health was devastated. A now completely dejected King Alphonso X really had no other options. He publicly renounced his bid for the throne, and then slowly made his way back to his own kingdom. Meanwhile, back in Granada, Muhammad I had died and was replaced by Muhammad II. A civil war broke out in his emirate, and Castilian forces, taking advantage of the weakness, began to raid his territory. Muhammad II figured he could kill two birds with one stone, and formally invited in the Marinid army, not just mercenaries, to deal with both. But then the emir lost control of his ally, and just couldn't keep the North African power from going on rampage. When he realized that he was no longer in control, he figured if you can't beat him, join him. Doubleday again gives us a really great account of what happened during the invasion of 1275. Quote, "The emir had now completed his preparations for the assault. It landed in wave after wave on the beaches of Andalusia. Abu Yusuf, who was the caliph himself, disembarked on August 16th, and then headed quickly to meet the King of Granada. While the King of Granada pillaged the territories around Jaén, the Marinids ravaged the lands in the Guadalquivir Basin near Córdoba, Úbeda, and Baeza. One Moroccan chronicler related how the emir's troops spread out, like a flood or a cloud of locusts. There was no tree they did not cut down, no village they did not destroy, no flock they did not steal. They killed all the men they encountered and took women and children captive. The number of prisoners grew like the flooding of the Nile." End quote. The Prince Regent, meanwhile, readied the Castilian army for battle. He was resolved to make his father proud. A massive force was thus assembled and headed south to meet the Muslim horde. They were determined to throw the aggressor back into the sea. But as Prince Ferdinand de la Cerda arrived at the city of Villarreal, which would one day be Ciudad Real, he came down with a horrendous fever. In a very short time, he lost the ability to lead his men, and then suddenly he became too weak to even walk. In a state of complete delirium, he was confined to a bed. On July 20th, 1275, his men found him, but he was no longer moving. The heir to Castile and the beloved son of Alfonso X had died. There was really no time to mourn his loss. The enemy was loose in the land, cities were being burned and people enslaved. Nuño González de Lara, who had been redeemed to some extent within the eyes of the king, assumed command of the army and led it further south. In September of 1275, the forces of Castile met up with the combined army of Granada and that of the Marinids near the city of Écija. In the book, The Wise King, there is a great description of the ensuing battle. Quote, "The army that Don Nuño had summoned was as thick as black night, or the waves of the sea. As the two forces faced each other on the battlefield near Écija, the Christian knights advanced rapidly, confident of victory. But the emir arose, and in a rousing speech, he called on his men to prepare for martyrdom. They embraced each other, saying their farewells, and entered the fray, their hearts beating hard. death becoming sweet to them. Chanting the name of Allah aloud, they went into battle. As the two armies met, nothing could be seen except the arrows plummeting down upon the Christians like red sparks. Blood dripped from swords as the heads of Christians were cut off and piled up. Abu Yusuf, the Caliph of the Marinids, ordered them to be counted. There were 18,000, according to the Chronicle. Among them was the head of Nuño González de Lara. End quote. His head was given as a gruesome trophy and perhaps even a subtle warning to the King of Granada. Later that year, in October, another Castilian army would be annihilated, and in this fight, the Archbishop, who happened to be the son of the King of Aragon, would also meet a similar end. But not all hope was lost. Alfonso's second oldest son, Sancho, rallied the men of Castile and brought into the clash neighboring Aragon, who at this point were ready for some payback. Sancho was able to stop the invasion, but he wasn't able to drive them out. As a result, Alfonso X decided to make peace with the Muslims. He was thus able to restore tranquility to his kingdom, but more importantly, he bought himself time to pick up the broken pieces of his life. It does not matter what society you are from, what language you speak, what religion you adhere to, or what time period you live in. No parent should have to bury their child. Alfonso had to do exactly that, and then went into a period of intense mourning. His ability to rule his own lands began to deteriorate, and the relationships that he had with his own family began to fall apart, including that with his wife. The King of Castile now found that his only true solace was to pour himself into creative outlets. And of course, he's not the only one in history to deal with massive psychological trauma in such a way. I mean, after all, Hemingway would write some of his greatest novels when he was dealing with depression. Picasso would have his blue period. And even Beethoven would compose the Ninth Symphony along with the Ode to Joy when he was dealing with not only bouts of sadness, but also with his loss of hearing. Alfonso became a massive sponsor of the arts and humanities once again. He helped in the process of creating just a multitude of books. Two of his more impressive works included the Book of Stones and the Book of Astrological Knowledge. But by far, his most famous contribution was a collection of poems with musical notations. This was known as the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the Songs of St. Mary. One of Alfonso's greatest long-lasting impacts, and not just for Castile, but on the world as we know it today as it would turn out, would be to try to make all of this accumulated knowledge more accessible to his people. He did this by replacing Latin with a more secular Castilian as the language of the land. Maria Menachal, in her book The Ornament of the World, puts it really well. Quote, Alfonso's brilliant gambit was to abandon Latin as a language no longer adequate for a modern society and its empire. He had a visionary grasp of the fundamental importance of having a society's own vernacular. In the period of Alfonso's reign, Toledo became the first laboratory in Europe dedicated to forging a modern language. This practice was the foundation for the revolution at hand. Latin was set aside as antiquated to be replaced by the transformation of Castilian from the merely instrumental into a noble written language. End quote. And by the way, if I haven't said this before, Castilian is where we get our modern Spanish. You know, the second most commonly used language on the planet. Now, Alfonso continued his commitment to his people and would continue to fund universities and be the patron of the arts. And this, for him, was healing. But he would never be fully the person he once was, ever again. It wasn't long until he was dealing with some major issues once again. The death of his son, aside from leaving a deep psychological scar, had also left him with a crisis of succession. Ferdinand de la Cerda and his wife Blanche, again the daughter of the French king Louis IX, had given Alfonso a grandson. But now Alfonso's second son, Sancho, demanded that he be made heir to Castile. The king vacillated back and forth on who would come to power. On one hand, Sancho held the respect and the backing of the noble houses of Castile. But on the other, his grandson held the backing of the entire French kingdom, which at that point had already moved military forces to the border to pressure his decision. The wise king eventually chose his second son to be heir, and then almost immediately had to begin intense negotiations with France, not only to soothe tidings, but also to keep from getting invaded. He was able to restore balance just in time. His kingdom would once again come under attack by the Marinids, who invaded in 1277. The Castilian counteroffensive he launched, which included a naval blockade of Algeciras, failed, and Alfonso would find himself struggling to establish equilibrium, not only for his kingdom, but also for himself. Eventually, his nobles and his family would find the wise king alternating between fits of despair and extreme anger. His actions would be characterized by his enemies in court as irrational and destructive, and in time some would find him unfit to rule, considering him to be a mad king. One by one, his own family members even began to distance themselves from him. This came to a boiling point in 1277 when he ordered the execution of his own brother for suspected treason. The sad part is that he might have been right. However, this was more than his family could take. Sancho, his heir, had finally had enough. In 1282, after a particularly hateful verbal exchange, the young prince broke off and started a massive rebellion against his own father. Sancho moved with deliberate speed to gain the support of the noble houses, of which nearly all of them rallied behind him. He then dispatched his brothers into the realm to claim strategically important cities and castles. He even managed to convince his other siblings, who were married to the various kingdoms that surrounded Castile, to abandon diplomatic ties with Alfonso. This was an unmitigated disaster. Sancho, in the blink of an eye, had nearly brought down his father's rule. Now, sadly enough, it was said that only the cities of Seville and Murcia remained loyal to the wise king. Alfonso was now isolated politically and abandoned by most of his family. In what must have been just extreme desperation, he reached out to the one person who nobody suspected would come to his aid. A letter was dispatched to, of all people, Abu Yusuf, the emir of the Marinids, and it read, quote, "O victorious king, the Christians have violated their oath of fidelity and have rebelled against me, together with my son. They say he is an old man who has lost his judgment and whose reason is disturbed. Help me against them and I will go with you to meet them." End quote. Ironically enough, the alliance worked out. It was even noted in the chronicles that Alfonso regained some of his health and was able to ride once again. The emir arrived in Algeciras in August of 1282 with his Marinid army. The concept that Alfonso now had reinforcements was a game changer. Cities and nobles that were on the verge of changing sides instead stayed loyal to the king. In fact, when Prince Sancho came to the city of Badajoz, which he figured would simply come over to his side, the governor rejected him, forcing the young prince to lay siege, which eventually failed. His army had to eventually retreat as the combined force of the Marinids and Alfonso's men were coming in. This incoming army laid waste to the Guadalquivir Valley. They nearly took Córdoba, and then they advanced up towards and then past Toledo. And then in November of 1282, Alfonso returned alone with his forces to attack Córdoba, and with impressive maneuvering he managed to take the city. The man may have been in the latter part of his life, but he still had some warrior king blood left in him. Sancho, on the other hand, reeled from one defeat to another. His severe failure at Córdoba was the epitome of this. His faction began to desert him, and the cities under his control proclaimed their allegiance for the king. Even the Pope would now get involved. Pope Martin IV issued a papal bull stating that anybody not supporting Alfonso would be faced with Christianity's highest form of punishment, excommunication. and as can be imagined, once that was said, everybody fell into line. The rebellion had ended, and once again Alfonso was the king of Castile, but now he had himself a Marinid ally, and a disloyal son that he would now have to deal with. Going back to the past for a good example, there is a great saying from the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a would-be philosopher king, that talks about anger. Quote, "Whenever somebody wrongs you, ask yourself at once, what conception of good and evil led him to commit such a wrong? And when you have seen that, you will pity him and feel neither surprise nor anger. It is not people's actions that trouble us, but rather the opinions that we form of those actions. So eliminate your judgment that this is of harm to you. Make up your mind to discard that opinion, and your anger will be at an end." End quote. Alfonso could have simply had his son executed, but in the end he didn't do this. He took some time and thought it through. Then, on January 10th in the year 1284, he proclaimed that his grandson Juan, again from the line of his first son, Ferdinand de la Cerda, would be the next king instead of Sancho. What's more, he emphasized that Sancho would no longer be in any position to lead and would be demoted to the lowest levels of court. The wise king had essentially banished his son. He publicly rebuked him, invoking the words, quote, "We, therefore, curse him as a man deserving paternal malediction, condemned by God and one who should be despised by all men, living henceforth as a victim of this divine and human curse. And we disinherit him as a rebel against us, as being disobedient, unrepentant, and ungrateful." End quote. Medieval fathers really know how to hold a grudge. Now, if the story continued as it were, Sancho would have been relegated to a footnote as the son who led a failed rebellion. But fate would interfere. In the spring of 1284, Sancho became desperately ill. When Alfonso got the news, he could no longer bear to see his son as a traitor and the instigator of a rebellion, but instead saw him simply as his son. This change of heart didn't exactly make a lot of political sense, but it did from the perspective of a father, especially one who had lost another son to illness. Alfonso, it was said, wept for Sancho. Thus, in late May of 1284, he wrote a letter to the Pope to vouch for his, quote, "beloved son," and ask for absolution of his sins. He thought, after all, that his son was going to die, and he wanted to make peace with him. Sancho would not only recover, but he would be restored as the heir to the Kingdom of Castile. However, only 2 weeks after Alfonso wrote his letter to the Pope, his declining health finally caught up with him. On April 4th in the year 1284, the wise king died. Doubleday brings us home nicely, quote, "If Sancho's rebellion had really tempted Alfonso to wrath, we could hardly blame him. But as he lay dying, the wise king may have done what many never achieve. He let go of his anger." End quote. The wise king of Castile stated in his will that he wished to be buried in the church of Santa Maria la Real in Murcia. Murcia was his first conquest, a deed that made his own father proud. She was a city that stayed loyal to him, and his remains lay there to this day. Alfonso X was criticized for many things, being a poor sovereign who failed numerous times as a king, having his kingdom nearly destroyed more than once, and being too distracted trying to become the Holy Roman Emperor. In the end, it would seem that he let his domestic affairs get the best of him, though I question how history would have treated him had he become the emperor. He may not have been a great warrior king as his father before him, but he had lofty ambitions, and as a philosopher king, he left an incredible legacy. History gave him credit for the Castilian Renaissance, and his move to establish Castilian rather than Latin made knowledge accessible to his people. This idea of a secular language, by the way, would catch on and flourish in 13th century Spain. Italy would do likewise, and other European nations would quickly follow suit. The literature that he would help create, like the Mirror for Princes, the Libro de las Cruces, and the Libro de Juegos, would influence a multitude of generations. In fact, the Book of Muhammad's Ladder, I am told, was an inspiration for Dante's Divine Comedy, and his most famous, Cantigas de Santa Maria, would be made into song and be celebrated ever since. And once again, the illustrations alone for the Cantigas are absolutely beautiful. His contribution to astronomy was also impressive. The Alphonsine tables, his list of stellar positions, would serve as the backbone of navigation through the Age of Discovery. Indeed, these tables would be updated for the next 300 years. It is said that they would even go on to influence Nicholas Copernicus in devising a heliocentric model of the solar system, and one copy of the tables, dated to 1492, can be viewed today in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence. It's signed by Galileo. What's more, the crater Alphonsus on the Moon, named in his honor, was a potential site for the Apollo 16 landings. But perhaps one of his greatest contributions was his dedication to a code of laws. The Siete Partidas, the 7 partitions, was a judicial system that covered everything from marriage to commerce and crime to public law. This law code would be adopted by numerous countries, including that of the United States. In fact, this contribution was so meaningful that a marble relief of Alfonso now hangs over the gallery doors of the main chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives. It gazes down on each president as they give the State of the Union address. Again, the man may not have been great in his legacy of being a warrior king as his father, who, quote, destroyed all of his enemies. Alfonso struggled to keep his realm together and dealt with incredible hardships both personal and as a sovereign. And to be fair, some of these were of his own creation. But towards the end of his life, he lived out the great saying, "To err is human, to forgive is divine." Alfonso made his mark as a philosopher king. There is a reason why books are written about him. He earned the title El Sabio, the wise king.